All right, folks, welcome to the February meeting of the Carolina Community Coalition. We are glad that you're here. We have a couple of folks switching over from teams, so I'm sure they'll be joining us. If you can, please in the chat, introduce yourself, tell us who you are and your organization or department that you represent. We are excited to have lots of folks. I see some folks from some of our other campuses here, so be sure to introduce yourself and tell us who you are. We also have the fancy webinar updated version of Zoom with us today, so you can use the Q&A function to ask questions of our speakers and panelists as we are doing our meeting today. All right, and apologies for the background noise over here. It's always a good time in the rec center. Great, and thank y'all for introducing yourselves. So we are going to get started. We are talking about party registration strategies today. We're very excited to have Elinor Landess with us. And yeah, I think we're excited. We got to hear some of the research that they've been doing at the International Town Gown Association conference last summer. And so it's really fun to get to see folks at a conference and then bring them to this meeting and to get to have some conversation about those strategies on our campus. So let me start with introducing Elinor Landess. Has spent her career thinking about the unique relationship between colleges and universities and their host communities. Currently the director of off-campus and community housing and assistant dean of students at Duke University. Elinor is a part of the team thinking about how Duke can be a good neighbor to the city of Durham and surrounding areas. Most recently, she served for 6 years as director of the Chapel Hill Campus and Community Coalition to reduce the negative impacts of high-risk drinking, which is a mouthful. In that role, Elinor developed expertise in collaborative public health-driven strategies used to mitigate the harm that collegiate drinking cultures can have on students and the surrounding community. Elinor lives with her wife and rescue pup in Durham, North Carolina. So welcome and thank you for being here, Elinor.
Thank you, Amy. It's a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to be speaking with folks who are just down the road, so to speak, in South Carolina. I'm from Charlotte, and so people who are from other parts of North Carolina say, basically, you're from South Carolina. So I consider myself an honorary South Carolinian. So I'll go ahead and share my screen with you. And we'll talk a little bit about strategies to reduce the consequences of underage drinking. So like Amy said, I am coming most recently from UNC Chapel Hill, where I directed that really long named coalition, the Campus and Community Coalition to Reduce the Negative Impacts of High-Risk Drinking. It used to just be called the Town and Gown Collaborative, but I don't think people knew what town gown meant. So there we are. What I'm going to be talking with you about today is largely drawn from my work in Chapel Hill, but it also comes from other schools across the country, as well as some good research. I'm sure a lot of what I'm going to be speaking with y'all about today will be relatively familiar, but it's my hope that hearing about a real world application of some of this stuff will be familiar, or if it's something that you're already doing, just like a slightly different flavor of how another community interpreted a different strategy. I also want to give collaboration credit to Dr. Aaron Bockenheimer. He is the Executive Director of Off-Campus and Community Partnerships at UNC Chapel Hill. He and I worked really closely together during my time there, and want to give some credit to him. So our time today is going to be spent sort of orienting, getting oriented to the issue, talking about research and practice, and then I'm going to talk through 3 different types of strategies that we used in Chapel Hill and that folks sort of are generally thinking about when they think about addressing underage and problematic drinking in university contexts. And then I'll end with a brief discussion of what success could look like, to use a Southernism there. So learning outcomes, session participants will learn what it means to take a comprehensive environmental harm reduction approach using community partnerships to drive strategies. So at the end of the day, the things that I want folks to come away with is the comprehensive nature of strategies that are being used at the community level, and that we're thinking about things from an environmental perspective. So I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean when I say that in a moment. We'll really drive home how important partnership was to the success of all of these different types of strategies, and that we all need to give ourselves grace, that none of this stuff is going to happen overnight. Whenever I introduced myself in my previous role, folks would say, "Oh, you have a lot of job security." When I would say, I'm trying to change the culture of the alcohol culture at UNC. So change takes time. So like I mentioned, we have a lot of this work is going to be drawn from the context that I was in Chapel Hill. The Campus and Community Coalition is the group that Amy mentioned that I directed. This is a group with a unique structure in that it was founded and funded jointly by the town of Chapel Hill, UNC Chapel Hill, and one partner you don't see on this slide, but is crucially important, and I'll talk about in a minute, is the Orange County Public Health Department. The health department was a little less involved in the application of our strategies, but they were really important to sort of the philosophical underpinning of the group. So then obviously our other two partners in this work were the town of Chapel Hill and UNC Chapel Hill. So the public health approach. So just a quick snapshot of what was going on in Chapel Hill at the time in 2013 when this group was starting to get going. Obviously, underage drinking was a problem that the university had been addressing for decades and that the town had been addressing for decades. What was unique about this rodeo is that the director of the health department got involved. And in her brilliance, she said to the chancellor and to the town manager and mayor at the time, what you have here is not just an enforcement problem, which is mostly how the town had been thinking about it. And it's not just an education problem, which is mostly how the university had been thinking about it. What you have here is a public health problem, a problem that is impacting the population across the board, regardless of whether you're a student, regardless of whether you drink or not. And so you need to change your framework to think about how this problem needs to be addressed. And so she said the public health approach is the way to go. So to just illustrate what that means, there's a parable that folks use. They call to demonstrate the public health approach. Many of you have probably heard this before. But the idea is you have a group of people standing on the banks of a river together. All of a sudden, they notice somebody drowning in the river and everybody rallies and everybody is working so hard to get this one person out of the river. And by the time they get them out of the river and folks are resting on the bank, they notice another person coming down the river drowning. And so everybody, but one person who stays behind with the person who they just got out of the river goes in and drags this second person out. And this happens again and again and again until finally someone says, what is happening upstream? What is happening upriver that we can look at and see what conditions can we change rather than this approach where we're responding in the moment at this crisis level. So they go upstream and they say, oh, is there a bridge that we can repair that, folks were falling in off of a broken bridge? Do people need swimming lessons? Is there a sign that we can put up? Is there a policy we can put in place that says, don't get this close to the river? And so when we think about the public health approach as applied to issues around substances, the best example that we currently have is with smoking and tobacco. So when we think about how historically we tell students about alcohol, we mostly say drinking is bad for you, drinking hurts the people around you, you're going to wake up with a hangover, you could end up with dependence, don't do it. But what we know from tobacco is that you tell a smoker over and over again to change their behavior. The thing that actually changes their behavior is raising taxes on tobacco, is putting tobacco products behind a counter, is making no smoking, making campuses smoke free, for example, and it becomes harder and harder and harder to access that tobacco. And so when we're thinking about that in the context of collegiate drinking, folks across the country are thinking of this public health approach, but it's not ubiquitous yet in the way that smoking, when we think about smoking, is. And so I think that's the direction that we have to go from here. And so that's the direction that we took in Chapel Hill that I'm now taking here at Duke in the city of Durham, and that many other schools across the country are working on. So comprehensive solutions. When we're talking about comprehensive public health oriented solutions, we're thinking about it in two different ways. The first, this is where I give a lot of credit to Dr. Aaron Bockenheimer. He has a phrase 3P, 2E. So philosophy drives your policy, drives your procedure and protocol, and then you have education and enforcement or accountability to drive home those 3Ps that you put in place. So when we think about the philosophy that we're operating under, we're thinking about this public health approach where we're trying to change the environment rather than change individuals. We have put policies in place in order to do that. So from an alcohol context, we're thinking about things like underage buyer checks or compliance checks. Procedures and protocols, we're thinking about things like party registration. And then on the back end, we're thinking about, well, our policies are only as good as people know about them. So we need to make sure that that education is in place and that the enforcement and accountability is in place to ensure that those policies and protocols are effective. So that's one piece of the puzzle. The other is thinking about the different domains of our environment so that we don't squeeze the balloon in one place and displace all of the energy elsewhere. So in the context of the Campus and Community Coalition, we were thinking about downtown, the campus, and the near campus neighborhoods. So we had strategies that applied to each of these three areas, and you'll see that reflected in the slides to come. So the other thing that we tried to do in Chapel Hill, and that all of us are trying to do, is either ground our work in research or ground our work in promising practices. This was more challenging than I would have thought because all of us, alcohol is ubiquitous in the world that we live in. And so all of us have personal experiences and personal opinions about ways to address problems associated with alcohol, and particularly alcohol in a collegiate context is a really visible problem. And so people have a lot of opinions. And so it was surprisingly difficult to keep our strategies grounded in research and grounded in promising practice. So I'm just going to share some of my favorites with you today. The NIAAA, National Institute for Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism, that might be incorrect, but I think that's the acronym. Has an intervention matrix that shows the efficacy of different strategies along the same line as the cost effectiveness of strategies. So I, as a campus, can go in and say, I have a really low budget, but I want to be as effective as possible. And so I'm going to only look at strategies that are in this high effectiveness, low cost category. Or I have a random community member who thinks they have a brilliant idea. I'm going to go check and see where that strategy falls on the intervention matrix and find that it's actually quite high cost and really low effectiveness. So I'm going to help steer folks through a conversation using that kind of a tool. The Safer California Universities study is one that specifically hits on one of the really high impact interventions that I'm going to talk about in a minute. And it demonstrates the effectiveness of that intervention having a population-wide decrease in drinking to intoxication across multiple schools and multiple cities in California. And so this is a really great tool to pull out for what is otherwise a pretty difficult to pull off policy change that would need to happen at the municipal level. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. The Maryland Collaborative, similar statewide model to what y'all are doing in South Carolina. They have a fantastic guide to best practices that we actually used when we were updating our strategic plan back in Chapel Hill. Highly recommend checking them out. The SPARK study, based off of the Safer California University study, and then the Campus and Community Coalition in Chapel Hill was then therefore based off of the SPARK study that was done out of Wake Forest, where they tested some of these interventions that I'm going to talk about today, had test schools that didn't do any of these interventions and test schools that did, and saw the efficacy of those interventions being put in place. And then UMass Amherst, this is just a really small validated study that I like, that shows the efficacy of this one school, exactly what they did and exactly the results that they saw. So that's a favorite of mine. And I'll share these slides with y'all so you can click on these hyperlinks later on. So research is one thing, but promising practice is another. So places where we heard things that were going really well for a community that we could hear about and say, well, would this make sense in our community? These are some of the places that we looked to, or that I look to currently. who are doing really good work. I'm biased, but I think Chapel Hill and UNC Chapel Hill are doing good stuff. I turn a lot to the city of Fort Collins and Colorado State. Same with the University of Vermont and the city of Burlington. You'll hear me mention those three schools quite a bit throughout my presentation. DC and Georgetown are doing something really cool that gets around law enforcement and having to be involved in things like loud and unruly gatherings. Is a really resource intensive intervention, but it's been going for like 10 to 12 years. So that's really cool. And then here's some other more private school context things if folks are at private institutions. Okay, so to rewind, our next step is to go through these different strategies. And so I'm going to spend time on I'm smushing policy, procedures, and protocols into one: education and enforcement. So I'm going to go through each of these three strategy types and then some examples of the different strategies that either we used in Chapel Hill or that I think are really cool that are being done in other places around the country. So we're going to start off with policy and protocol. So this is the intervention that I mentioned from the Safer California University study. This is the highest evidence base and the evidence of the most effectiveness out of anything that I'm going to talk with you about this afternoon. And it is the most difficult to pull off politically. We worked on it for 2.5 years while I was in Chapel Hill, and it still isn't done. So it is an ordinance, and it is meant to, like the research shows, reduce drinking to intoxication, but also, as the name of the ordinance would imply, reduce the amount of loud and disruptive gatherings that a community is dealing with. So we got a lot of support in Chapel Hill from the community for this ordinance. Yes, they were concerned about students drinking, but they were really concerned about the impact of loud and disruptive gatherings in their living spaces. The other thing that this ordinance does, for example, in Chapel Hill, we had a noise ordinance that was responsible for addressing 5 guys on their back porch playing beer pong and 500 people spilling into the street with a band on a roof. We only had one tool for both of those instances. And so this particular ordinance is intended to be for those really, truly loud and disruptive gatherings. And it's inclusive of things beyond just noise. It can include trash, obstructing traffic, parking violations, and underage consumption. So it's a really fantastic tool to help address these gatherings that really become out of hand. The other thing that's unique about this ordinance is that it is mostly intended as a deterrent. So the community that we spoke most closely with was Fort Collins, Colorado, and they found that they were only using this loud and disruptive gatherings ordinance like 5 or 6 times a year. The rest of the time, a simple noise violation was all that was needed to address, a relatively small party where students were really compliant. No real damage to the community beyond just, it was kind of loud. We asked them to turn it down. So that deterrent effect is possible because the ordinance requires that there is no warning and that there are really high first-time fines. So in Fort Collins, Colorado, the first-time fine is $1,000. So again, this is not intended, I would not, as a law enforcement, if I were a law enforcement leadership person, tell my officers to go out and issue loud and disruptive gatherings violations for something that is like 50 people and under, like that kind of a party is never going to receive this type of ordinance. And that's exactly why we see a deterring effect. So students, rather than saying anybody come, are now paring down to a much smaller guest list, for example. They're adding that much more critical thinking in their party planning as they move through this process. And like I said, there's a really strong evidence base here that you achieve a population-wide decrease in drinking to intoxication without displacement to other locations. So you're not seeing displacement to the dorms, you're not seeing displacement to the bars, because you are addressing access to alcohol at these environments where there's a lot of access to alcohol. You're decreasing the amount of access by taking the party scale from 500 to 50, for example. So really, really cool tool, but again, challenging to achieve. So much lower on the efficacy scale, we're going into a promising practice here. Property owner outreach. University of Vermont and the city of Burlington do this really well. Chapel Hill now also does this. Many other schools do. There's a joint database that tracks calls for service and violations. In Chapel Hill, this was done as a collaboration with code enforcement and law enforcement. Once a property got to a point where, say, they had 1 trash violation and 2 noise violations or calls for service in a year, the property owner or the property management company is notified. In North Carolina, we have preemptive laws that keep us from having this be any sort of punitive consequence. It is just an FYI. There are some states where you could include rental license implications for if a property owner is contacted so many times. But what we used it for in Chapel Hill, and my understanding of what it's used for in Burlington, is just hey, we want one more partner on our team as we're trying to address some of these gatherings that are in the neighborhoods and being disruptive, or properties like parking, for example. Parking violations can really add up if students aren't paying close attention to where they're parking on the street. So that's one strategy. Monday morning wrap up, similar. A lot of schools have this in place, but you'd be surprised how much that extra amount of communication. This was put in place during my time in Chapel Hill. So I lived without it and then lived with it. And the amount of coordination and consistency in follow-up was really helpful here to allow what folks would do is review all the calls that came in that were student related, and then establish a plan for follow-up. And what this really allowed folks to do is, again, really get some consistency in what that follow-up looked like, so that one case wasn't totally slipping under the radar and one was being escalated to the highest level of student conduct, for example. So another helpful policy or protocol that has been put in place. Okay, party registration. So I'm going to spend a little bit more time here. This is another situation where this was put in place while I was in the role, but Chapel Hill is by no means the only school to take a look at here. Fort Collins, Colorado, University of Colorado Boulder are 2 that we looked at really closely when we were implementing this program. So how it works is that any student registers a party with the municipality. So they do it through the university as a proxy. So if I'm a student and I'm having a party at 123 Sesame Street, I go and fill out a form online with the university. And then I say, this is my name, this is my phone number, this is my address. If there's an issue at my property, I would prefer that you call me, or I would prefer that you text me. And then the university, a student has to show up in person at the university to complete that registration process. And then the university sends that information to the patrol commander for the shifts for Thursday, Friday, and Saturday night. And so that if a call comes in and they see that it's a registered party, rather than having to dispatch an officer to the scene, that patrol commander is just either making a quick phone call or shooting a quick text to the person who registered the party. This is beneficial on multiple levels. One, law enforcement isn't having to deploy resources from another area of the city in order to tell a student party just to be quiet. 2, on the neighborhood side, they're getting a much quicker response time, again, because they're not having to wait for a patrol vehicle to travel across the city. They're just quickly getting a warning text or call. And on the student side, we saw a lot more trust build a lot more quickly than we would have expected, because students are benefiting and that law enforcement isn't showing up on their doorstep. And so they feel like they can protect themselves and their friends in that case. Now, if that party doesn't get shut down and officers do have to be dispatched, the presumptive outcome is that those students are going to receive a citation. In Chapel Hill, like I said, we needed to do some trust building in order to get this off the ground. So I think we launched it in a spring and we had 20 parties registered. And then the next fall, we had 120, for example. And then by the time I left, we were having over 500 parties registered each semester. Honestly, the biggest challenge here is the students who are choosing to register their parties are the students who want to do the right thing. And so you're still having issues with those really loud and burdensome parties, which is why we also were pursuing that loud and disruptive gatherings ordinance, because we needed a way to address this group of people who wasn't taking us up on our offer here and really was hosting really, really significant gatherings. In Chapel Hill, the municipal police department requested that fraternities and sororities not be eligible for this program. I don't know where that stands now, but that was an interesting flavor to Chapel Hill's program that is very different than other examples across the country. So that's party registration. Now moving on to education, I'm actually going to start again with party registration. 2 phases of education for that process. One is in that online form. It takes students through suggestions for hosting a safe gathering and suggesting hosting a gathering that's not going to end up having law enforcement having to be deployed to their gathering, which is helpful on the front end to just again add another point of critical thinking. But then they have to complete their registration in person. And so that allows an opportunity to have a conversation. What kind of party are you having? What are you providing in terms of food? Just adding another point of connection where students can make some better choices. And, you know, if we hear, oh, you're planning to have a party bus arrive, like, let's think about strategies to mitigate the impact on the neighborhood, for example. So that was a really helpful component, educational component of party registration. Another strategy when we're thinking about educational strategies is good neighbor education. Most schools across the country have some flavor of this in place. In Chapel Hill, the way that we did it is we had 3 sort of phases. One was door-to-door knocking on both student neighbors and long-term resident neighbors, just to say to the students, hey, these are strategies to be a good neighbor, and say to the long-term residents, hey, just so you know, the university cares about this. This was done jointly with the town as well, but that the town and the university collectively care about this issue. And we want you to know the strategies that we're telling our students. So we told our long-term residents about party registration, for example. So that's at the night before classes start. Then there's a block party, which is a great opportunity for long-term residents and student residents to mix and mingle. And then there's some real-time education. We stole this from UMass Amherst and I believe Colorado Boulder, where on high-risk nights and days of the year, we would send a team of student volunteers along with some staff out into the neighborhoods to grab folks, point in time and say, hey, just so you know, you're going in and out of a residential neighborhood here. Be mindful of your noise and trash. So that's another educational strategy. Bar outreach. So like I mentioned at the beginning, we're talking about strategies along 3 locational dimensions, downtown, neighborhoods, and campus. We've mostly been talking about neighborhoods so far, but in terms of bars, when we're thinking about education, there's different opportunities here. I've actually heard about some really wonderful things that are happening in Columbia. So hats off to y'all for the work that you're doing there. Conducted by law enforcement groups or students or advocacy groups, or sometimes I've seen this done where all 3 are collaborating together. The research would tell us that an annual or semi-annual reminder of the enforcement protocol ups your efficacy when you're thinking about compliance checks or making sure that folks aren't selling to underage later on. So that annual or semi-annual reminder of the enforcement protocol coming from law enforcement is quite helpful to just remind folks that they need to be on their game. In Chapel Hill, we connected this work to bystander awareness and violence prevention, which was actually much more popular with our bar community. They didn't want to be talked to about making sure that folks were trained effectively in checking for fake IDs, but they really wanted to talk about making sure their bar was safe, you know, in terms of keeping incidents of sexual assault or sexual violence down that could originate or happen in their establishment. And then the last piece I'll say here, this was something that I get a lot of questions about. In Chapel Hill, the police department started putting out notifications on social media every time they were doing alcohol-related enforcement. And folks were like, this is such a horrible idea, but it's based in this research that I highlighted in the second bullet point, that reminders of the enforcement protocol are actually really helpful tools to boost efficacy. So rather than just saying, oh, well, they're just going to pay attention on this one night because you reminded them, what we've found is that it helps folks pay attention, because even if they're not one of the bars that's getting notified, or excuse me, that's getting visited that night, they're still seeing that notification and they're making sure their folks are on their toes and making sure, oh shoot, I have this one new employee that I haven't trained yet. So we saw some really good benefits from that. Educational sanctions, most schools have these in place. Best that I have come across in terms of well-researched is Basics, which is a motivational interviewing tool that helps students think critically about the amount of drinking that they're doing and whether that's in alignment with their values and their own choices around their health. Community living class is something that's done at a lot of schools that's unrelated to alcohol, but is related to alcohol fueled behavior. We're about to start this here at Duke. Chapel Hill does it. UC Boulder does it. CU Boulder does it. It's basically a class that says like, hey, let's learn about the community that you live in and recognize that you're not the only people who live here. Often you'll have things like videos from neighbors talking about the impact of living close to college students. Efficacy here I have not seen any research on this, but have heard good feedback from students who have been involved across multiple schools. And then eChug is another tool that students can use to assess their own drinking. Often it's used in combination with Basics. Sometimes all three of these are used as sanctions. And you see the highest efficacy, particularly with eChug and Basics, if those are universal sanctions, so that one student isn't having to write a paper reflecting on the poor decision that they made and the other is doing Basics. You see much higher efficacy if everyone is going through these classes and experiences that help them think critically about their level of alcohol intake. Loud party follow-ups. This is similar to a protocol that I mentioned in the first section, but after a party gets either a noise violation, a warning or a citation, law enforcement and institutional representatives can visit properties. Here at Duke, I visit them without law enforcement, but in Chapel Hill, I know they visit with law enforcement. Within the first week after the complaint or violation, the research grounding this is that it is not the strength of the punishment that matters the most, but that the certainty and swiftness that punishment is coming. So just a reminder that someone is paying attention. These are educational visits, but they are educational visits that say, hey, you're subject to consequences for your behavior. And then speaking of, that moves us lastly into enforcement related strategies. So compliance checks, I'm sure that y'all are familiar. These are checks to make sure that folks who sell alcohol are not selling to people who are underage. The goal here is to decrease sales to underage. Research that I have seen shows that these are most effective when they are universal. So while I was in Chapel Hill, for example, the police department there used to just check the places where they heard complaints about or where they knew a lot of students were being served underage. They changed that policy to where everyone in town was checked. That was not without its hiccups, I'm going to be perfectly honest. However, we saw the pass rates of those compliance checks go up because everyone across town was training their staff. Everyone across town was paying attention to the issue of underage drinking. The other change that happened while I was in Chapel Hill that is based in research is that these checks are happening at least twice annually. That is like the bare minimum, the research says. For example, the town of Carborough, next door to the town of Chapel Hill in North Carolina, they're doing checks at least 3 or 4 times a year on each business. And so efficacy really goes up there. And like I said, the results are you see an increase in the pass rate, which is great. Alcohol-related enforcement operations. These happen at the street level, so just intervening with individuals who have open containers potentially, or who might be trying to purchase underage in an establishment, and they also happen in establishments themselves. In Chapel Hill, we worked hard to get some consistency during the first 6 weeks of the school year. We are not unique in that, and during high-risk celebrations. And the research here would show us that consistency and visibility are what matter the most. Diversion programs. So this was a really cool thing that happened in response to minor misdemeanors being decriminalized in some parts of North Carolina. Again, the refrain here is that it's not the severity of the punishment, but the certainty and the swiftness. So what this does for minor misdemeanors, which in Chapel Hill and in Durham, noise violations, open container violations, and underage drinking violations all fall within this category of minor misdemeanors. They are diverted from the court process. So an officer, upon encountering a noise violation, for example, they have the choice to divert that student to what's called the misdemeanor diversion program rather than writing a citation. That means that on Monday morning, rather than filing paperwork with the court system, you are sending your paperwork to the county social worker, who then meets with every single student or person who's received a low-level misdemeanor, and they make a referral to the appropriate resources. In Chapel Hill, they had university-specific resources that we worked on collaboratively with the county law enforcement system, the court system, and the DA's office to say, like, yes, we feel good about these programs. We feel good sending violators to these programs that are specific to students. Here in the city of Durham, they're just universal. So anyone who receives any minor misdemeanor goes to the same misdemeanor diversion process that's done through Durham County. But this has been a fantastic resource, again, to keep students out of the court process, but ensure that accountability is still happening. All right, and then lastly, to wrap up, what does success look like? So just a couple of examples here. Again, that UMass study that I like, they implemented a number of these strategies that I've outlined here today and saw that their binge rate and frequent binge rate went down. What they found overall is that they were able to make high-risk drinkers, folks who are drinking at the most severe level, into more moderate drinkers. So we're not talking about like enormous scale of results here, because UMass is pretty typical of what kind of results folks are seeing across the country, but we're talking about going from high risk to moderate risk, which is still pretty significant. The Safer California University study, again, we talked about population-wide decrease in drinking to intoxication without displacing to other locations. And specifically in Chapel Hill, this is just some local data that we have. We see things like the proportion of alcohol serving businesses that pass compliance checks, like I mentioned, going up from about 70%, which is not great, to over 90%. We saw impacts on high school students as well, a reduction in the amount of high school students who reported drinking at all. And if you look 2 rows down, proportion of high school students who report binge drinking. We also saw a reduction in the amount of drinks per week amongst UNC Chapel Hill students, and an increase in students using harm reduction strategies, which was great. And then this last number is the one that I think is most impactful, is the number of underage individuals treated by Orange County EMS for alcohol went down significantly in this year, where interventions were first being talked about during this year to when we were 3 years into our strategies. So that's all I have for y'all today. I'll stop sharing for now, but if we need to come back and look at specific slides, I'm happy to pull things back up.
Thank you so much, Elinor. So much good information packed into there, and I just am very appreciative of how quickly you were able to just put all of that information in 30 minutes. It's impressive. I want to take a second to introduce our panel, and I know we have at least one question in the Q&A. One of our panelists has having some technical trouble, so we'll have to ask her question for her. But let's start with the introductions of our panelists. Tad, will you start us off?
Hi, I'm Tad Derrick. I serve as the Associate Director of Harm Reduction and Compliance in the Office of Fraternity and Sorority Life here at USC.
Great. And Captain Grabsky.
Hey, I'm Eric Grabsky with our University of South Carolina Police Department.
Thanks. And Sergeant Bewig.
Hey, I'm Sergeant Anthony Bewig. I'm with the Columbia Police Department, and I run the Metro Region Community Response Team.
Great. So very grateful to all of you for being here today. And Blair Lehman is having some technical trouble, but we'll include her question. Tad, will you start us off? What conversations, what thoughts has this spurred for you, and what questions do you have for Elinor?
I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. I definitely was frantically scribbling some notes about things, and was also affirmed to hear some things that we've been trying to implement here over the last few years. We're already in there, so love to hear that. One of my questions is kind of Columbia specific. We have two very happening entertainment districts, and over my time here, we've seen more and more of our students spill into the Vista, which for a long time was a more older adults type entertainment district, but still I would say the main focus of the mass is the 5 Points area. And I'm curious, especially when you're in Chapel Hill, what success you had with buy-in from places like bars and restaurants, because I think a lot of times as the university, those places just see us as affecting their bottom dollar by trying to enforce or to change the alcohol culture around. And I also know that some of our game day areas feel similarly. So I'm just kind of curious how, like, any tips, tricks, or stories you had about creating buy-in with those establishments.
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's where that like change is slow piece really comes in. So I'll say we had one thing that was really an unfortunate tragic event that worked to our advantage, happened right when we were starting this work. We had a student be served at 3 of our main establishments that we think about as sort of like the student bars, was served underage at 3 in one night, and then went on to drive the wrong way on the interstate and kill an entire family in a car accident. So that really sad, unfortunate thing meant that we now had 3 less bars that were 3 more bars that were thinking about maybe quality over quantity, is how a lot of those bar owners were talking. We also, the compliance check was like, it was a tough sell when those started happening more consistently, but folks sort of came around to it, and it became a like, oh, these guys don't even take it seriously. Did you hear they failed kind of thing? Like it became a point of pride when businesses were passing those. However, I will say one of our groups that took us up on bar education most frequently was also one of our most notorious places. So they were great about making sure all their staff were trained, sending them to every single educational opportunity, and they still on the back end remained a sort of sore spot for the community. So there was no magic bullet, but a lot of the team of good guys continued to grow. And it was a lot of relationship building and like getting people in. And whenever we had a bar that was doing a good thing, like we had a bar that really got into bystander intervention, and we got them some really good press as a result of that, and built sort of a whole community around this one bar that had been kind of okay, and then became one of our best bars in town because they were getting a lot of really positive reinforcement for the things that we're doing. So there's no one thing. We had a couple of different sort of circumstances in place.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you for that. That increase in the compliance rate is incredible, right? From 70 to 90% is amazing. Captain Grabsky, I see your finger. You're next up for us.
No, I've gotten out of the habit of Zoom meetings, so I'm please forgive me.
You're fine.
So Elinor, thank you so much for being here. I took down some great notes regarding some of the great programs. It's good to see that that great minds think alike, and some of the things we're already doing as well. But you certainly gave some great nuance to some of it. One of the areas that I'd really love to ask you about is education. And let me give some context to what we do. So as it stands now, if there's an individual or a group of individuals that are cited or receive some type of an ordinance violation, are visited by the police, then part of their sanction is, like you mentioned, we have a community living workshop where both the police department and our off-campus student of off-campus living and neighborhood relations collaborate, and we discuss all those things from the noise and how not to have the police called. If the police are called, how to handle that. But I'm wondering if, and it's a good reactive tool, but I'm wondering if there are any other projects or tidbits that you could give us about education. One of the areas that you mentioned was social media, and our department's really taken off with that in the last year and a half. So I'm seeing that as maybe, because you mentioned some great success with that social media and the consistent social media, but I'm wondering if there's any other preventative educational tools that you're aware of or have come across that we might be able to glean some good information from.
You know, I don't think we ever nailed that in Chapel Hill, and I'm new enough that I'm certainly not nailing it in Durham. But two places that I think are doing a really good job, Fort Collins, Colorado, is fantastic with their proactive student education. I think a lot of it is because it is student designed and student run. So it's just like really visually appealing stuff, but it's visually appealing stuff that's telling you could face $1,000 fine for hosting a party. So they do a really good job. In terms of other things that are student oriented, that's the one that comes to mind the most. I'm sorry I don't have more to offer there, but I think that that's a really tough nut to crack because of the amount of noise that students are facing.
Sure,
I
and you know,
wonder about, I'm
sorry,
sorry.
go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just wondering if that's some of the role the party registration process starts to play
Certainly.
for folks, is that you know, as you're walking through that form that's asking you,
Yep.
how are you going to do this or that? It's forcing the student to think through kind of safer party
Yeah.
planning.
Yeah, I was
do you
thinking
see that?
I was thinking the same thing, but what I was also thinking is this phenomenon of the students are really trying to do the right thing and
Mhm.
trying to be proactive
Yeah.
to begin with, part of that. And one of the thoughts I had as we were talking is that perhaps the party registration is a key component of the education and the social media blitz, so to speak,
Yeah.
the year that we know. And within that education, we highlight things like the fine, and years ago we had to look at our entire enforcement policy regarding alcohol and drug violations, because what was happening is, and it wasn't just at our institution, but what was happening is students were it was just like a trophy to get a ticket, right? And
Oh gosh.
nothing was, yeah, right. So we actually instilled some pretty hefty fines regarding our alcohol and drug and then subsequent violations. So that really helps. So I think that you're right. It's like sometimes the thought is, well, how much can I do before I get caught? And if I get caught, that consequence. And then in the mind of the student, it's like, well, how far can I go or what should I do? But I really think maybe combining that social media educational blitz along with the party registration might be something that we could really do. So that's a really great idea. Thank you.
Yep.
Sergeant Bewig, do you have anything? I know we have one question in the Q&A. I want to make sure we get to it.
Yeah, I do have a question. You mentioned during the party registration, this will kind of be like a two-parter, that fraternities and sororities weren't necessarily involved in registering parties. So were there any specific reasons as to why? And then a public safety standpoint, my team patrols are in one of our entertainment districts, and there are fraternities and sororities who host events and parties at local bars. And would it be a good idea to maybe recommend that they register these events through the university?
Huh. Good question. So for the reason why, I will say perfectly honest with you, they were never very public about it, about the reason why. My understanding is that the philosophy there is fraternities in particular have enough latitude that they did not want to be hemmed in by like, you have to get a warning first. They wanted to be able to warning, text, or call first. Law enforcement wanted to be able to show up and immediately shut the party down without having to do that warning, text, or call. That is, I think, what they were thinking. In terms of registering events at licensed establishments, I haven't heard of that happening, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't or it shouldn't. I just imagine I can imagine it feeling like a benefit for the licensed establishment, because I know like we had a few bars who always got noise complaints called in on them, and then they would end up with a fine from either the fire marshal or a visit from law enforcement. So that could end up feeling like a benefit, or it could end up feeling like someone's breathing down their neck. So I don't have a great answer there. We used to encourage our students to host at third-party vendors rather than in the neighborhoods. The idea being that at least you're concentrating things in the entertainment district, but our entertainment district is also like right next to a neighborhood. So it's a tough balance for sure.
Thank you.
Mhm.
It's definitely that balloon, right? We have to be conscientious about where we're
Exactly.
pushing people around in. So interesting. One question from the chat that I think is a good one is interested in a comment about the swiftness of the response being more important than the severity of the punishment. Can you say more about that? Is that true of kind of all alcohol and drug violations, or is it specific to certain types of answers, certain types of citations? Sorry.
I don't have like the research citation on that. I don't remember where I encountered that, other than that it was from law enforcement literature rather than prevention literature. So it's not necessarily just applicable to alcohol and drug related cases. I think it comes from the criminal justice world. And there was a second part of your question. Just say more about it.
Yeah, just tell us a little bit more about what that research tells us about.
Yeah. So rather than saying like, I'm going to prosecute a minor in possession case to the fullest extent of the law every single time, the research, as I understood it, gives us the same amount of efficacy for just ensuring that every single time that minor in possession case happens, you are sure that you will be caught and you are sure that you will be held accountable. I think I've seen that borne out in real life in dorms. The caution that students take in their dorms versus the caution that they take in their neighborhoods, where it's much more difficult to have that certainty and swiftness and enforcement, at least in Chapel Hill. Versus the dorms, there is certainty that you are going to get caught and that you will be held accountable quickly. And so we always operated from that philosophy in Chapel Hill. And here in Durham, I know our student conduct office works to get cases that happened over the weekend processed within the week, because that's still fresh in your memory, and ensure that I send a letter to the student saying, hey, I know you violated this policy. Not from a student conduct perspective, but from a like, hey, we're paying attention. So I can search and see if I can find where that came from. And if I find it, Amy, I will send it y'all's way.
Thanks, I appreciate that.
It was sort of an underlying assumption that grounded a lot of our work, rather than a like, we're referring to this in the literature. It was like a, we have come to understand this as truth in the same way that we come to understand the public health model as truth.
Makes sense. We'll have to ask our criminology folks and criminal justice folks about some of that.
Yeah.
You know, because I think we see that with issues when we've got parties in neighborhoods when law enforcement responds, but citations are not issued.
Yes.
I would imagine it's getting at that same concept of like, there's not a certainty of a punishment, and so therefore, or a consequence, and so therefore you're more willing to take the risk because it's a roll of the dice whether you'll have a significant consequence or not.
Yeah, we saw the exact same thing.
Yeah. Blair posted a question. I want to be conscientious of our time. She asked about just sort of fostering relationships between off-campus property managers and landlords which are often viewed as an extension of the university, even though they are completely, separate from
Yeah.
us. Can you share any suggestions or tips you have for kind of navigating those relationships and having everybody work in the best interest of our students?
Yeah, I've been in 3 different sort of town gown roles that are addressing student behavior in the community at 3 different institutions, and they all 3 work really differently. So at Michigan State, they have rental licensing in the state of Michigan. So it is a very cut and dry business relationship. If there's a violation, you will be held accountable because the fines that come from rental licensing pay for the code enforcement officers and pay for the staff time that can do that follow-up with landlords and property management companies. So we still are trying to have, from a university perspective, a positive relationship with them, but there's this huge municipal tool that was available to get a lot more compliance than in Chapel Hill or Durham, for example, where in North Carolina, rental licensing isn't allowed. And you have to be really careful about what you're requiring of property owners and managers. In Chapel Hill, we took a real, we are inviting you to be partners here approach. And we are always offering an FYI rather than a come down. And in Durham, so far, that's the same approach that I'm taking. Just because we don't have that extra tool available to us. I will say, the other thing that both was happening in Chapel Hill and that I'm now doing in Durham is a lot of education for our property management partners, inviting them in for seminars about what the student conduct process looks like, if something happens on their property, or what resources we have to offer students. Or we invited the International Center for our last educational seminar on just cultural competency tips for working with our international students. So really treating these folks as partners has been helpful when I've had to have these harder conversations, but no great magic there.
That's really helpful. Captain Grapsy, jump on in.
So I have an age-old question for you, Elinor, and you may not have the answer, but you may have some direction for us to go.
Yeah.
We have the longest time tried to figure out where in the heck our off-campus students are living. We have a good idea where some of them are living, but we really, you mentioned this in part of your presentation regarding going out in the community, and we've done things like that before. But other than kind of seeing where the, Gamecock flags are and the, and the student decals are, have you come across, from when students register at school, or have you found anything that helps?
Yeah. So the best situation I've been in so far is at Duke currently, and it's still pretty poor. Students are self-reporting their addresses. I've already had multiple conversations with the registrar about this because it's a problem for student behavior, but it's also a problem for students in crisis, for example. When our students are using self-report data, we have addresses in Massachusetts, and we know our students are from Massachusetts, but they're certainly not living in Massachusetts now, or it's from their study abroad last semester and they just never changed it, or it's 123 Sesame Street. I will say we have a great partnership between our municipal and our university law enforcement, where the municipal PD calls our university law enforcement, and there's a joint response for issues involving students. In both cases, the officers are instructed to get student IDs. And so we're gradually getting a better way to hold the student leaseholders accountable at places, but that's all reactive. But, at the beginning of the year, for example, I was just going to the address and saying, I understand a Duke student lives here and I understand you did something wrong. Who wants to own up for it? And that was that's not working. So that's been a really helpful partnership, but the best that I have seen, I think Michigan State did something recently, where they changed how they're asking students for addresses, and that has really changed the game for them. So they might be a good group to follow up with up in East Lansing.
Great, thank you so much. I'll track down
do.
Well,
Sue
thank-
Webster is the Michigan State person.
There you go. I want to say thank you for the information, for the presentation, for taking the time to share your expertise with us, because it's been a really great conversation. And I think I speak for all of us when I say, hopefully we are walking away from this with some ideas and some strategies of things that have been floating around that, you know, we're doing a lot of things that you mentioned well, and then there are things that I think we can add on to. And so
That's
it's
great.
really nice to have that direction for what our next steps look like. So
I'm
thank
so
you so
glad. And
much
I'll
for
always
sharing.
say it was helpful for me when I can say, well, Duke is doing this. Well, Carolina is doing this when I'm trying to build support for something. So please
Mhm.
use all these other schools to your advantage.
Yes, definitely. The other Carolina's doing it, so that means we can too, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, great. Thank you so
Thank you for
much.
having
Thanks
me.
to our panelists, and everybody have a good night.